loved hearing kind of everything about how you got to where you were, mostly just because so much of it resonated with me in a polar opposite experience kind of way, even though there's not really too much that opposite, I would say. It's a weird, the structure is opposite, but the content isn't. So I'm Turkish, I grew up in Kansas. I grew up in Overland Park. And growing up, it was like, Kenan, that's kind of a weird name. We always pronounce it Kenan. What are you doing here? What are you doing? Why are there Turks in Kansas? And it was, from a young age, it was like, well, there's a military base in Leavenworth. Turkey's part of NATO. And you start spiraling into the geopolitics of a situation just to explain why you're in this classroom with a weird name. And
been there, brother.
Yeah, and so it resonates. And so you go through the motions, but for whatever reason, that was just horrible for me. It wasn't like, Kenan, you've got to start telling stories now that you've gotten so good at reiterating the family story over and over again. I hated stories. I hated reading. I hated writing. I was a slow reader. The duck was, the like little third grade reading about the duck. I still don't know what happened to him. But I just was not, I couldn't fathom why anyone would want to read when you could pick up a Game Boy and play Pokemon instead. It was just, because that world was so magical, it was so full of color, so vibrant, and reading was very slow for me. And so I was like, okay, I've got to do not reading. What's the best way to do that? So I went to undergrad for history, because that's really exciting reading. A lot of not dry at all. But no, it was this innate, I would say, being, Turkish in Kansas, being really interested in where you come from. We had a lot of relatives back in Istanbul. My grandparents immigrated to Kansas, but we would go back every summer. And so Istanbul, which I'm not sure if anybody here has been to Istanbul. I know you've been in it, and so he can attest to this at least. But it is such a golden city. It occupies this special niche in my memory of just pure joy, endless summers. I mean, it helped that we only visited in the summer, so I still don't know what an Istanbul winter is like. But it was just a land of summer and sunshine and late sunsets and muezzins calling, and it was so very different than Kansas, which is a land of vegetables and tornado sirens instead of muezzin. So it created this kind of interest in an aspect of myself that I was only half privy to. So I wanted to study history, and I went to school to study history. I went to K-State because it was down the road, and it was where my parents met. But they didn't offer a whole lot of Turkish history courses. So I did the best I could. I took Russian history instead, and I was like, they at least share the Black Sea. But while I was doing this, I found myself starting to write, somewhat interestingly, not at all about Turkey. I was like, I should write about a boxer in 1930s Shanghai who takes on a seedy, corrupt promotionist. I'm reading Ernest Hemingway and I'm reading Dashiell Hammett, and I'm like, this is what it means to be a good writer. I started boxing. I was like, you have to be a boxer if you want to be a good writer, just like Hemingway. I mean, that was 1930. It's 2010 when I'm doing this. And so I was writing all this horrible Hemingway impersonation, a lot of just kind of stewing and thinking and punching and drinking and being a real man's man. And a professor...
Teach us the ways. How would you do?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Such a paragon of manliness over here.
Don't self-deprecate.
But I had a professor, I don't know why, I just sort of picked it up as a way to kind of continue to explore history, because I was always fascinated with these strange stories from the corners of history that you don't quite learn about. And it never occurred to me to write about Turkey. And so about halfway through undergrad, a writing professor at K-State was like, hey, maybe you should switch your major and get out of history. And I was like, yeah, there's probably no jobs in history. I'm sure there are plenty for a creative writing major.
So you did it for the money.
Yeah, well, as I do everything, it's for the money.
It was for the money.
So it was kind of at the end there, I thought about maybe writing my first Turkish story, and that actually kind of coincided with the Gezi Park protests that swept Turkey in 2013. For those unfamiliar, I'm doing it again. I'm doing the
Yeah.
let me tell you all about it. Blah, blah, blah. In 2013,
Ataturk, 1920.
Yeah, exactly. Go all the way back. World War I. So in 1913, the Turks kind of got fed up with the authoritarian backsliding of the government. And what started as like 50 people protesting the removal of a tree in one of the last green spaces in Istanbul turned into 5 million people in the city alone over 2 weeks protesting, spreading to multiple cities throughout Turkey. I mean, it was just this huge, you can kind of think similar to the Women's March protests globally. It was like the same numbers, larger number. For that country, obviously nobody was protesting in New York. But it was one of the largest protests Turkey had ever seen. And this is a country famous for protests, famous for coups, failed coups, attempted coups, planned coups, email coup. Turkey invented the first email coup.
Respect.
Yeah. They couldn't be bothered.
How do you sign off an email?
I don't know. I should look.
Respectfully yours?
Well, they even like created a new word. They were like, it's a memorandum, an e-memorandum.
Oh.
Yeah, and they were like,
e-memorandum.
yeah, I guess it carried
Kindly
all the
go.
Right. I think they drew a tank
rocks.
at the bottom. And we're like, us, you, you know, yeah.
Careful.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. But it was this like huge watershed moment for Turkey, but also way more of a watershed moment for me. Turkey has been in protests on people for a really long time. For me, Istanbul was just happiness. It was really old aunts and uncles dancing like they were 15 years old. I mean, it was pleasure cruises through the Bosphorus. It was sticky dondurma ice cream. It was happiness. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. All my life, I was told that Turkey is this progressive, democratic country, one of the bastions of democracy in the Middle East. Suddenly they have a dictator. So it became like the dichotomy of what I thought Turkey was, what I was as a Turk, and the reality of Gezi, authoritarian backsliding, protests, waves of corruption, in the 70s alone, people were just shooting each other, just being in different political parties on school campus. And I didn't know any of it. And my mother grew up in that, and my grandmother. And I was like, you guys didn't tell me. What the hell's going on? So it was, in a way, having kind of the desire to look at forgotten histories.
Yeah.
And a desire to shore up my identity that felt very fastly fading in the new reality of what Turkey actually is, and everything being kind of counter to everything I ever knew. I started scrambling, and I think what some people might do, and I really applaud this, I'm so really not interesting, but I couldn't write it kind of as a memoir, or I'm just a really boring person. You can ask my wife. So I had to invent. I wanted to figure out what Turkey was, but I wasn't a real Turk in my mind, so I had to go find real Turks. And for me, what that meant was writing a collection of stories. I didn't think you could capture what it meant to be all of Turkey with, it's at a crossroads. You have Kurds, Armenians, Azerbaijan, Jews, Orthodox, Muslim, Turks, Balkans. It's just all right there. Histories from 3 different empires, all collapsing in time into one space. And the McDonald's right next to the obelisk right there. And so it's such a incredible cornucopia of culture there that I had to do it in a bunch of different stories.